One reckless act in a gilded Manhattan ballroom was all it took to permanently erase the quiet, careful life Maeve Dunbar had spent 26 years building. She did it to save a stranger. She did it without hesitation, without a plan, and without the faintest idea that the man she was saving didn't need saving at all. The Whitmore Foundation Gala occupied the entire grand ballroom of the Pierre Hotel on a cold Saturday in October, and from the outside it looked exactly like every other charity event Maeve had worked this fall. Too much money pretending to care about people who didn't have any. She moved through the crowd in her catering blacks, a tray of billicat salmon, blanc de blanc balanced on her palm, navigating the constellation of Balenciaga gowns, and Brioni tuxedos with the practiced efficiency of someone who had been doing this job long enough to become invisible. That was the trick with these events. Become the tray. Become the uniform. Don't make eye contact with a man who just paid $700 for a glass of champagne. He'll leave half-finished on a ledge somewhere. At 26, Maeve was 2 years into her JD at Fordham Law, surviving on financial aid, 3 catering shifts a week, and the particular kind of exhaustion that came from studying criminal procedure at midnight after spending 5 hours serving hors d'oeuvres to the people who made criminal procedure necessary. Her younger brother Callahan had been in outpatient therapy in New Haven since their mother passed. Weekly sessions, not cheap, and the money had to come from somewhere. Fordham's scholarship covered tuition. The catering covered everything else. She didn't mind the work. The Pierre paid well, and the crowds were orderly, which was more than she could say for the South Bronx block parties, where she'd run her EMT volunteer shifts for 2 years before law school consumed every remaining hour of her life. She'd picked up emergency medicine the way she'd picked up most things. Impulsively, because someone needed help and she happened to be standing there. A paramedic instructor at her undergrad campus had told her she had steady hands and a clinical instinct that most medical students never develop. She'd taken the certification and spent 2 years on a Bronx volunteer rig before the LSAT changed her trajectory entirely. That was the version of her life she understood. Tray, uniform, contracts, briefs, exams, brother's therapy bills, repeat. The anteroom changed everything. It was just past 10 when Maeve slipped through the service corridor to retrieve a fresh case of sparkling water from the hotel's catering hold. The corridor ran behind the grand ballroom and connected to a series of smaller event spaces. The Cotillion, the Astor Suite, a narrow reception anteroom with glass-paneled doors that the foundation had reserved for VIP donor meetings. The doors were nearly shut. A thin slice of amber light fell across the marble floor. She almost kept walking. Later, she would understand that the part of her brain trained by 2 years of criminal law had processed the visual data before she consciously registered it. The angle of the taller man's shoulders, rigid, compressed, closing off the room. The way the shorter man stood slightly behind, and to the right weight shifted to the balls of his feet. Not a conversation. A containment. She had studied the body language of coercion in Professor Walsh's criminal evidence seminar and written a paper on psychological duress in contract law. She knew what this looked like from across a hallway. She moved closer. Through the narrow gap in the glass panels, she could see 3 men. 2 of them she didn't recognize, mid-40s, immaculate suits, the kind of professional composure that came from years of making uncomfortable requests in quiet rooms. The third was seated at a small mahogany table, a single document in front of him. He had his back to the door and she could only see the back of his head. Dark hair, broad shoulders in a charcoal suit jacket that sat on his frame like it had been built there. He had one hand resting flat on the table beside the document. He hadn't picked up the pen. The taller man leaned down and said something with his mouth very close to the seated man's ear. The seated man didn't move. The shorter man reached slowly into the interior of his dinner jacket. The motion was deliberate, unhurried, and unmistakable to anyone who had ever ridden a South Bronx ambulance at 2 in the morning and understood what it meant when a man reached inside his coat during a disagreement. Maeve's training did the rest. Her hand was already moving to her phone. She pulled up the voice memo app, hit record, and shoved through the glass doors. "I'm so sorry to interrupt," Maeve said, and she said it at full volume, her voice carrying bright and clear with the practiced projection of someone who had learned how to direct a panicking crowd at an accident scene. All three men looked at her simultaneously. She kept moving, past the doorframe, into the center of the room, her phone raised. "I've been recording this conversation for 4 minutes. I have the document on camera. I have both of your voices. And I have the full name of the foundation that rented this room for the evening, which means we already have venue surveillance pulling in right now from the hallway cameras." Every word of it was improvised. She had been recording for 11 seconds. The taller man straightened. His jaw tightened in a way that told her he was calculating rather than panicking, which was actually more frightening. "Excuse me." His voice was smooth, barely accented, completely controlled. "This is a private meeting." "I understand that." Maeve kept her eyes on him, and not on the shorter man's hand, which had stilled inside the jacket. "Which is why I'm giving you both the opportunity to walk out of it right now before I step back into that ballroom and start showing this recording to the 2 FBI agents who are working security on the event perimeter tonight." There were no FBI agents working security. She had no idea who was working security. She was building the bluff in real time. The taller man and the shorter man exchanged a look over the seated man's head. The shorter man's hand withdrew from his jacket. Both of them adjusted their expressions into something neutral and professionally aggrieved. The particular face of men who had been interrupted in the middle of something they intended to finish at a later date and wanted her to know it. "We'll continue this through the appropriate channels," the taller man said to the man seated at the table. Then he looked at Maeve, and the look was the kind that filed away her face for later. "Enjoy the rest of your evening." They left. The glass doors swung shut behind them, and the anteroom went silent except for the muffled string quartet from the ballroom and the sound of Maeve's heartbeat in her own ears. The man at the table didn't move for a long moment. Then he exhaled slowly, and even that single breath carried something controlled and deliberate about it, like a man who chose the pace of every physical thing he did. He turned in his chair, and Maeve finally saw his face. She'd been holding her phone up this entire time like it was a shield. Her hand dropped an inch. He was perhaps 35, with a face that had been built for authority, clean jaw, dark eyes with a quality of stillness in them that felt less like calm and more like the surface of very deep water. There was a small white scar that cut through the outer edge of his left brow. He looked at her, and at the phone still recording in her hand, and at the document on the table that he still had not signed. "How long were you actually recording?" he asked. His voice was low and unhurried like the rest of him. Maeve held his gaze. 11 seconds. He said nothing. Then the right corner of his mouth moved. Not quite a smile. Something more private than that. 11 seconds, he repeated, and they believed 4 minutes. They couldn't risk that I was telling the truth. She finally lowered the phone completely, her hands steadier than they had any right to be. "Which is the entire point. You should go, separately from me, and you should tell your hotel security about those 2 men before you leave the building." "Mr. Castillo." The voice came from outside the glass doors, and a man stepped through. Large, close-cropped hair, a suit that barely accommodated his shoulders. He positioned himself between Maeve and Theron Castillo without appearing to do it deliberately. "Vehicle is at the 5th Avenue entrance. We have a situation developing outside." Castillo. The name landed in Maeve's chest like a stone dropped into standing water. She had heard the name in criminal law. She had read it in her organized crime seminar. She had written 2 pages of notes on the Castillo Syndicate for a paper on RICO statutes and federal racketeering last spring. Theron Castillo, 36 years old, officially the CEO of a Manhattan-based private equity firm called Meridian Capital. Unofficially, the subject of a multi-agency investigation into shipping fraud, labor racketeering, and extortion across 3 states. A man the federal government had been attempting to prosecute for 7 years without landing a single successful charge because every witness either recanted, disappeared, or developed a sudden and passionate commitment to the Fifth Amendment. She had just barged into a private room, lied through her teeth, and driven off 2 men who were apparently threatening him. She had saved Theron Castillo. From what, she didn't yet know, and that was the part that was starting to make her knees feel unstable. Miss Castillo stood. He was taller than she'd calculated from the seated position. He picked up the unsigned document from the table, folded it once with one clean motion, and slipped it into his interior jacket pocket. His eyes hadn't left her face. "What is your name?" "Dunbar." The word came out before she could decide not to give it. "Miss Dunbar." He said it the same way someone picks up a tool they intend to keep. "You need to come with us." "I'm working," Maeve said. "You're not working anymore." He moved toward the door, unhurried, as though the matter was resolved. "The men you just threatened are Serrano associates. They run photographs of every person who interacts with their targets. By the time you walk out of this hotel alone tonight, they'll have your face and your name. I'd like to prevent what happens after that." Maeve stared at him. Outside the glass doors, she could hear a commotion building somewhere, raised voices, a crackle of radio static, the particular controlled urgency of security personnel trying not to alarm a ballroom full of wealthy people. "I don't know you," she said. "You know who I am," Castillo replied, "and I know you just lied to 2 armed men to get them away from my table. Whether that was brave or suicidal is still being determined." He held the anteroom door open. "I'd prefer to have that conversation somewhere less exposed." Maeve looked at the door. She looked at the large man with the close-cropped hair who was watching her with the patience of someone accustomed to waiting for people to come to the correct conclusion. She had 11 seconds of audio and a law school education, and the slowly solidifying understanding that the 2 men in the anteroom had not been the most dangerous people in it. She walked through the door. The convoy was 3 vehicles, 2 black GMC Yukons flanking a central Cadillac Escalade with blacked-out glass and what Maeve recognized, with the particular nausea of someone who had just understood a situation fully and too late, as ballistic plating along the lower doors. 8 men in suits moved with the coordinated precision of people who did not need to discuss who stood where. Castillo walked without looking back to verify that she was following. She was following. They had just cleared the hotel entrance and reached the vehicle when the first shot hit. It came from above, a parking structure across 5th Avenue, and it didn't hit any of them, but the windshield of the lead Yukon spiderwebbed into a white constellation of cracked glass. The next 2 seconds were a controlled implosion. Castillo's men materializing from positions she hadn't noticed, the Escalade's rear door opening from the inside, a hand on her shoulder, not gentle but not violent. Guidance, not force, and then she was inside the vehicle, and it was moving before the door had fully closed. Esteves, Castillo's voice from the front, calm, factual status. The large man from the anteroom, Bram Esteves apparently, was in the passenger seat. He had his head turned away from her, talking rapidly into an earpiece, and then something happened to his posture. A small change, barely visible, like air going out of something. "I'm hit," Esteve said, matter of fact, almost apologetic about it. "Where?" Not a question from Castillo. An instruction. "Upper thigh. Through the door seam." Esteves turned enough that Maeve could see the dark spreading stain on the left leg of his trousers, already impressive in size, going larger with every second. "It's arterial," he said, and even his assessment of his own emergency was delivered without theatre. Maeve was already moving. She didn't make a decision so much as she observed that a man was bleeding from a probable femoral laceration, and that she was in the vehicle with him. The rest followed from that. Let me see. She was between the front seats before anyone stopped her, and no one stopped her. She pressed her fingers against the inside of Esteves's thigh, above the wound, and leaned her body weight into it. The blood was bright and coming fast, not arterial spurting, not transected, but laceration with arterial involvement. Bad but manageable if she managed it right now. I need something to tie off above this. Belt, strap, anything with length and grip. Her voice had shifted without her noticing into the register she'd used on the Bronx rig. Direct, stripped of everything that wasn't useful. And I need the vehicle to stop moving in whatever direction is shaking us around, because I can't hold position like this. Driver, Castillo's voice, and then the vehicle's motion smoothed and steadied. One of the men in the rear passed his belt forward. Maeve looped it around Esteves's thigh, above the wound and below his hip, and pulled it tight with both hands and then her knee for leverage. Esteves made a single controlled sound through his teeth and said nothing after that. "Hold this," Maeve told the man nearest to her, guiding his hands to maintain the pressure while she checked the wound itself. Through the torn fabric, a jagged laceration, maybe 3 inches deep, not transected but close. She packed it with gauze from a first aid kit that materialized in her peripheral vision, as though someone had been waiting for her to ask. She hadn't asked. Someone had simply understood what she needed. "How far are we going?" she asked. "Red Hook," Castillo said, 12 minutes. "Faster." "Faster," Castillo said to the driver. 11 minutes. The safe house was a converted loft on a quiet block in Red Hook, 4 stories of unmarked industrial brick overlooking the Buttermilk Channel. From the outside, it looked like every other repurposed warehouse in the neighborhood. Inside, it was clean and deliberately spare. Concrete floors, minimal furniture, the particular blankness of a space maintained rather than lived in. There was a full first aid station built into the kitchen cabinetry that went significantly beyond first aid, and a man already present who introduced himself as Dr. Anselm. She caught the first name only, who had been called ahead and arrived 2 minutes after they did. Maeve stood back and let him work, her hands still bloody, her catering blacks ruined, the 11 seconds of audio still sitting in her phone's voice memo app like a small dark joke. Esteves was stable within 40 minutes. The doctor's prognosis was straightforward. Surgical repair needed within 24 hours, but no immediate threat to life. He'd be moved to a private facility at dawn. Maeve sat on the concrete floor with her back against the kitchen island and her knees drawn up to her chest. The adrenaline had gone out of her system the way it always did, all at once, leaving something hollowed and trembling in its place. She remembered this from the Bronx rig, the call that ended and the 20 minutes after it, where your body didn't understand yet that the emergency was over. She heard Castillo's footsteps before she saw him. He moved quietly for a man his size. He came around the island and looked down at her for a moment, then lowered himself into a crouch, bringing them level. He'd shed the dinner jacket somewhere. The sleeves of his dress shirt were rolled to the elbow, and his forearms had dried blood on them from where he'd helped move Esteves. He didn't speak immediately. She'd noticed that about him, he treated silence as something he was entitled to, rather than something that required filling. 2 years, he said finally. What? You said 2 years of training in the car. His dark eyes were very steady. Not medical school. EM'd volunteer South Bronx, she exhaled. I dropped it when I started law school. You didn't drop it. She didn't answer that. He wasn't wrong. Bram would be dead, Castillo said. He said it the way he said most things, without inflection, but with the particular weight of a man who understood what the words actually meant. The belt, the packing, the pressure point, that was the difference. It was your apron sash, actually. She looked at her hands. The belt came from one of your men. I used the apron sash for the secondary wrap. Something moved through his expression that she didn't have the energy left to categorize. The Serranos will identify you by morning, he said. His voice had not changed. Facial recognition from the Gala cameras, your Fordham ID, your Bronx records, your brother's address in New Haven. He paused. They are not careful men. They will use every piece of information available to them, and they will use it without hesitation. The floor was very cold through her uniform. Is that a threat? It's an explanation. He held her gaze. I don't threaten people who just saved 2 members of my organization in the same evening. Maeve stared at him. Outside, the buttermilk channel was invisible in the dark, but she could hear the water, low, rhythmic, indifferent. Somewhere in the loft, one of his men was speaking quietly into a phone. The doctor was packing his case. The city was existing entirely without concern for any of this. She thought about Callahan's Thursday appointment in New Haven. She thought about the first-year property exam she had in 11 days. She thought about the 11 seconds of audio still on her phone that amounted to nothing and had cost her everything. So what happens now, she asked. Theron Castillo stood. He was very still for a moment, looking out toward the blacked-out windows and the dark water beyond them. When he turned back, his expression had settled into something she could only describe as inevitable. The look of a man who had already decided on a course of action and was only now delivering the news of it. Now I deal with the Serranos, he said, which was already on my schedule before tonight. You accelerated my timeline, not my decision. He looked at her directly. And now I deal with you. Maeve's chin came up. I'm not a problem for you to manage, Mr. Castillo. No, he agreed. You're not. His voice had dropped, the particular quietness of something serious being said in a room that was already quiet. You walked into that anteroom with 11 seconds of nothing and drove off 2 armed men because you recognized what was happening and you acted. You then kept a man alive in the back of a moving vehicle with an apron sash and 2 years of volunteer experience you chose not to mention until I asked. He paused. You're not a problem. You are the most unexpected thing that has happened to me in a very long time. She should leave. That was the rational response. She knew who he was. She had studied his organization for a paper she got an A- on, because Professor Walsh had noted that her RICO analysis was thorough. But her section on witness deterrence lacked nuance, which was ironic in retrospect. She knew exactly what the Castillo name meant and exactly what proximity to it did to people's lives. She also knew that if she walked out of the Red Hook loft alone right now, she would not make it back to Fordham. She knew what the Serranos were. She had read those files too. You can't protect me indefinitely, she said. Not indefinitely, Castillo agreed. But the Serranos are a problem with a defined solution, and I intend to apply it. What I'm telling you is that for the duration of that solution, you are under my protection. That is not optional. His dark eyes held hers with the same quality she'd observed in the anteroom. Deep water, very still, with something moving underneath it that she could sense but not name. What I'm also telling you is that afterward, Miss Dunbar, I'd like to offer you a different kind of arrangement. One that doesn't involve you serving champagne to people who would sell you to balance a spreadsheet. She looked at him for a long moment. You don't know anything about me. I know you lied without breaking eye contact and got 2 professionals to back down in under 30 seconds. I know you triaged arterial bleeding in a moving vehicle while someone was shooting at us. I know you're 2 years into a law degree you're paying for yourself while supporting a younger sibling, and that you haven't stopped thinking since you got in that car, and you're still thinking right now. He said none of it with warmth exactly. It was more like an inventory, precise, complete, offered without editorial judgment. I know enough to know I want to know more. Maeve stood, because sitting on a concrete floor, while he looked at her like that, felt like a position she should not remain in. She was almost his height. Almost. She met his eyes at close range and she understood, with the same instinct that had pushed her through those glass doors 2 hours ago, that she was standing at the edge of something very large, and that whatever she said next would determine which direction she fell. What kind of arrangement? She asked. Theron Castillo looked at her the way he had not looked at anyone in that anteroom, not at the Serrano men, not at his own lieutenant, like something worth protecting, like something worth keeping. The kind where your brother's bills are taken care of, he said quietly. Your tuition is never a question again, and you use that law degree and those hands and that instinct that just saved Bram's life for something that actually matters." He paused. "And the kind where anyone who wants to reach you has to go through me first." Outside, Red Hook was dark and cold and completely silent. Somewhere across the water, Manhattan glittered on like it always did, entirely unconcerned. Maeve Dunbar looked at Theron Castillo and felt the trap close around her, not with violence, not with force, but with the slow and terrifying precision of something that had been built exactly to her dimensions. And the worst part, the part she would spend the next several months refusing to examine honestly, was that she did not entirely want to leave.